Hello and welcome back for our final session of the day here at CogX, which will close out the festival. And we're here to discuss something that is so critical, and there are a few matters that are as critical as the one that we are about to discuss now, and that is building inclusive, sustainable communities, particularly for immigrants. With COVID-19, nationalism, and racism on the rise, what is next for migrants? Studies show the pandemic has had a disproportionate impact on immigrant communities, hitting their living standards and access to healthcare the hardest. We take a closer look at the role of migrants in the pandemic response and how mutual understanding can help to heal disenfranchised societies. Leading the session as our moderator is Théo Scubla, who is the founder and CEO of EachOne, an organization rooted in the belief that migration is not the movement of misery, but the movement of talent. He's a real visionary who has been globally recognized for creating economic opportunities in France and beyond. I could not think of a more impressive combination than the three individuals on this panel here today. I really am in awe of you all. Please make sure to drop questions in the Q&A box throughout the session. We want them to be asked while we have the time together. Théo, over to you. Take it away.
Thank you, Safara. Hello, everybody. As you said, we are facing a very paradoxical, complex, polarized situation, covered with a lot also of stereotypes. And to try and better understand it, today I have the pleasure to exchange with Isra Chaker, who is a civil rights activist, campaigns and advocacy expert and public speaker, and today she represents ACLU. And I'll be also with Saba Nafees, who is a scientist, entrepreneur, a lifelong student, born in Pakistan, who moved to Fort Worth in Texas. And when she was 11, and she's passionate about movement building, finding tangible ways to help undocumented youth. And Saba is a data scientist at Zuckerberg Biohub. So I have a first question for you both. What's going on? What's going on? Really, the pandemic disproportionately affected refugees and migrants. How? Can you give us a quick overview of the situation first, Saba?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me here. I'm, really, really honored to be here with the two of you. I think we're going to have a really amazing discussion and engaging conversation. Yeah, these are really rough times. I think last year really just kind of shook our world, especially the world of people who are coming from various different backgrounds that are underrepresented, minoritized, and from different places fleeing violence and just fleeing for their lives in the midst of this worldwide pandemic. So there's a lot going on there, a lot to unpack. But what we've seen is that time and time again, we've seen that the way the pandemic has affected people, it has affected them disproportionately. So if you're poor, if you're an immigrant, if you are a person of color, if you already had financial insecurities and were not able to live the best life that you wanted to, it got even worse, and it still is bad. So we're not out of the woods yet, and there's a lot still going on, and I think it's really important for people like us to really, look at this with a critical eye and try to understand what's going on and really try to find ways to come up with solutions at the local, national, and global levels.
Thank you, Saba. Isra, you're an activist. What do you observe from point of view about the situation?
Thank you, Théo, and thank you again for having me. I'm so excited to be here with you all. And Saba, thank you for starting us off so powerfully. Laying the context is critical, and it's important before we talk about solutions to this pandemic and the vaccines and what we're hopefully starting to turn, a tide point in this awful year and a half that we've been experiencing. It's so critical to recognize the impact that this pandemic has had on the most vulnerable, right? Migrant communities, people of color, Black communities, and especially in the US context, which is what I'm here representing as an activist in my own personal capacity, being someone who's been involved in grassroots organizing and mobilizing for many, many years. I've seen the impact of the rhetoric, the Trumpism rhetoric, the nationalism that we've experienced over the past few years in the US, the Islamophobia that has been directed at me, the anti-Asian hate that's been directed at our Asian community, especially in the rise of COVID, the direct racism and the indirect transgressions and discrimination against other communities of color. It's been an awful time, and you really can't talk about COVID pandemic, and you can't talk about any issue really in the United States without talking about the intersection of that important the important piece of the racism, xenophobia that we've been witnessing. And it's been really challenging, I think, as an activist and as someone who is directly working in solidarity with these communities, hearing what they're working on and seeing the work that they're doing to not only support their direct community as they're experiencing these attacks, but to also find solution-oriented and shift systems and change things institutionally in a way that they were not meant to change in this context, right? You would think that being in the United States that we would be the most prepared for something like COVID-19. We were, in fact, not prepared at all, as many people saw, as many countries were. But I think it was a very big challenge for us because here we are, we've invested so much as individual taxpayers and as people and as immigrants into this American dream and into this country, to only see that this country did not prove to come back for us and support us during this time of this pandemic. So lack of access to healthcare, lack of starting with the testing of all of these things, especially for immigrant and migrant communities, that was really critical, that no one knew where to get information. A lot of information was not translated at the beginning into different languages and accessible to different communities. There weren't paths where different communities could find access and resources and people to help them. We're talking also about, and that's continued, by the way, even with the vaccine status is here, and we can get to that in a little bit. But when you're infected and you're in the migrant communities, they're living in predominantly dense, highly populated communities, multiple family members in one apartment. So let's say someone got the virus, it was almost impossible to self-isolate. And then you talk about the work aspect and the economic impact of that. They're also working jobs, these communities that don't qualify for paid leave, that don't qualify for benefits and support. And you're seeing that some of them would still have to go to work. So there was a serious concern in migrant communities of not necessarily going to get tested, even if they presented with symptoms, because they knew that getting tested and having to isolate meant no paycheck for their family, meant no meal for their family that night. So there was a lot of tough decisions and choices that migrant communities had to face that was very different from the privileged of many of the American context and the American population. And that's what I've been really want to focus on, is that those challenges were not unique to just the United States, right? Migrants everywhere were experiencing this. But in the United States, I think what was unique here was that you would think we would be better. But unfortunately, we're not. And unfortunately, that coupled with the racism and the xenophobia just created a really awful culture here, where I think many people faced and dealt with a lot of anxiety, a lot of mental health issues, and a lot of what that social and psychological impact of living in a pandemic while still having to survive really means.
Thank you, Isra. As you said, the challenge is global. There is a real need of change, of systemic change and profound change regarding the approach we have of the migrant question. I would like to stress maybe one figure. In this report, Refugees Work, so it's more precise on the refugees topic, TENS Foundation showed that investing €1 in welcoming refugees can yield nearly €2 in economic benefits for society within 5 years. We are talking about investment. So from a cost to speaking about wonderful potential, how to change the narrative about migration and really concretely make everybody understand that the value it brings for all is wonderful.
Right. Well, I can jump right in here on this point. I think, Théo, this is something that I've worked in a lot, especially when I worked for an NGO, an international NGO at Oxfam, was a lot of these conversations around refugees and around migrants in the United States, and obviously changing that narrative. We're talking also about asylum seekers, right, at the southern border. We're talking about temporary protected status holders, many different groups of people who ultimately all have the same root causes of why they're fleeing. And really, no one chooses to flee. People don't choose to become refugees. And I think we all know that people are forced to make those decisions as a matter of life and death and protection of their family and survival. So we talked a lot about what does it mean to even shift the narrative in the US pre-COVID. for these communities. And how do we do that? And a lot of that is the onus and responsibility on us as individuals, people in different communities across the country, people in communities that are more rural, more so than urban, because even in urban settings, you find that given the urban settings calling on higher education levels, different types of industries to work in, more thought process, more highly skilled, developed thought leaders, you'll find that in those contexts, and certainly politically, you'll find that they'll lean a certain way, that it's not, the narrative isn't the worst there, even though, of course, there are people, no matter where you are, that still get it wrong, and they're still, anti-migrants in many ways. But we really focused in on how do we put out the true resilience, the true courage of these migrant communities and these refugees? How do we share their stories? How do we amplify their voices? And so that was primarily our strategy, was giving them the mic as much as we possibly could, highlighting the real authentic stories and their narratives versus, spewing or repeating what we were seeing being played out on the right-wing media by certain elected officials, including, our president at the time. We continue to see that by putting their stories and narrative first, it was helpful. Now, of course, there's this concept that you can consider as facts versus fears, right? A lot of these fears that are rooted in, that are based off of what people are hearing from these elected officials that are obviously unfounded, biased, racist, xenophobic, all these things we've been saying, Islamophobic. A lot of them can be combated very easily with simple facts, right? In terms of national security, in terms of economic benefits, all of them can be combated with simple facts. So we really stuck to the facts in our narrative, and we didn't highlight or put any emphasis on those fears, because the more you reiterate them, the more they're allowing them to fester and have people grow and think about them. But the more that you just stick to facts, the more helpful it is. And we've seen in the US context in general that refugees in particular give back to their communities on the local, state, and federal level tons more than they take in benefits. We're talking billions and billions and billions of dollars more. And there's a report that was published a couple years ago, by a federal agency that stated this and that proved this. And then people know this. And we've seen, without even needing these reports, we've seen the contributions they make. We've seen that as a community, we all benefit when multiple people from multiple backgrounds and multiple journeys come together and live, in a united collective way. And I think that's the most important thing. Refugees don't need to prove to us that they're worth being here or need to be here because they can support us economically or support us financially. That's not the burden on them, and they shouldn't be seen in that way, right? But you're right, this data, the statistics and the data speak for itself, that they do contribute in incredible ways. And we need to also value their stories and resilience even more than their contributions, because to me, that's what it means to welcome people. That's our moral compass and our moral obligation.
Exactly. Thank you, Isra. Saba, how do you think we can neutralize the topic and really see things as they are and therefore change the narrative?
Yeah, I think I love everything you're saying, Isra. It's completely exactly what I've been thinking about, and many of us have been thinking about. I think the problem here, though, is that obviously we're preaching to the choir. We understand, we've been here and we've been fighting for this, and we've been reading the data and uplifting the stories and highlighting both the facts and the figures and all of the faces and the stories. But the problem here is that there are certain people who do not want to welcome migrants, who do not want to welcome refugees, who believe that they should just continue to suffer in the country they're coming from because, for example, in the case of America, America is theirs and not, belonging to people like refugees. So we have to find a systematic way to deal with that type of sentiment. And growing up in Texas, and I'm a diehard Texan, and I lived a good chunk of my adult life in West Texas, and I think that people there are amazing, friendly. But you mentioned the gap between urban and rural environments. I think what happens in those different areas, rural areas, perhaps you don't necessarily and of this migration and lots of amazing things happening of that nature in a place like that, perhaps, and therefore in contrast to New York or San Francisco, for example, where I'm at right now. So what happens is that over time and over decades, those sentiments continue to get developed, and in a way they exponentially rise from generations, right? And so that fuels the political mentalities of different parties and different leaders. And then we saw what the last 4 years did to this country and the rest of the world. And so I think those things, we have to really dig down to where it's all starting from and try to solve it from there. Because, what happened the last 4 years, we do not want to repeat that ever again. Not here and not in any other major country. And so, I think the point here is that, as a data scientist, I'm always after facts and figures. Like, okay, if I just show this one person who disagrees with me, this political leader, advocated so much on the Hill in DC and talked to mostly Republican lawmakers, and my goal is always, okay, let me just show them these facts. Let me just show them the stimulation that migrants and refugees bring to our economics and to our GDP, and how much they help us grow, and how much tax dollars they fuel. I want to think about all those things, but really I think what it comes down to is sharing those stories and those faces, and having that person in the room, for example. That's even better. I think that a lot of these sentiments are originating from the fact that these people have never really met, somebody like me or somebody like you. And so they are very much in oblivion, which is unfortunate, but we have to change that. We can't just look at them and say, not that we're doing this right now, but we can't just say like, well, you just don't want to look and you don't care about us. You don't, but we have to try to change their mindsets by showing them those stories and showing them those stats. And I think that's what I've always been passionate about. And I think that's what our organizations and movement building groups need to work towards, is that we really connect with the person, for example, a lawmaker that's putting together these policies about refugees or migrants, and we need to help change their minds in that way. Not just from facts and figures, which I'm more inclined to do immediately, but from stories and from faces and from bringing those people there in person.
That's true. Thank you, Saba. Because in fact, even if we share stories, even if we share facts, sometimes we see, as you said, some people didn't meet you, and we see that there is kind of a hierarchy that tends to emerge between nationals' needs and migrants' needs, and as if we had to make a choice between them. And as you said, even if we share sometimes good things, good stories, good facts, people don't seem concerned. It's not for them. It's not about them. It's not their interest we are talking about. And there is one thing Obama said in 2019 I would like to share with you. He said that one of the biggest challenges in the 21st century is mutual understanding. In fact, we see, and that's what you said, that society, and maybe it's one of the root cause of the problem, is compartmentalized. People live next to each other, but they fear each other, and even if they see good things about each other, they don't really meet. However, they are, after all, people who belong to the same society. So concretely, and maybe I'll ask this question to you first, Saba, how to build ties, enable true inclusion in the end?
Yeah, that's so tough. President Obama really did leave a legacy of, trying to instill that type of mutual understanding between people, between leaders all over the world, and here, of course, the United States. But then what followed was the exact opposite. In terms of who's leading our country, and it goes to show that we can't afford to elect corrupt leaders. We just can't. So that's one thing, first of all, and secondly, in order to gain that mutual understanding, again, like you mentioned, it's really tough to do that in the face of when the person on the other side is it doesn't have to deal with me. So why do I need to help welcome refugees? Why do I need to help, build a refugee, center that's helping, et cetera, and helping at the border, for example, in Texas? I mean, it's insanity over there, and I think, people slowly over time, maybe perhaps due to technology and in the ways of living now, they find a way to live within their bubbles, and they really don't seem to care about these issues. And again, I will reiterate the fact that, we have to continue to find common ground. And as President Obama said, finding that common ground and mutual understanding is very, very difficult. That is why he named it a huge challenge of our times right now. But I would like to say, starting off with things that make us find commonalities between ourselves, I think is the most important. For example, Ellis Island, what happened there, right? Like, people came over, they were fleeing, they were trying to find opportunity and freedom in America. Like, I mean, come on, like, we just have to go back to the history just a little bit, not even that long ago. And we have to say, like, what about these things? Like, we have to find a way to, because, for example, like, many Americans, for the most part, unless you're a Native American, you are an immigrant. Your grandparents, great grandparents, etc. And so you can find common ground that way. Many times that does work. Many times it doesn't, because sadly, Americans are really bad at geography and history. So that's one problem. But yeah, I mean, like, just being able to connect on the common ground is like, even if some person doesn't have that immediate immigrant background, they might know somebody, right? Their teacher may have been, an undocumented American, right? Like, so I think, I think it's really, really important to, again, like, find that emotional connection, like your great grandfather came through Ellis Island or was an immigrant to the United States. So what do you think about that? Because of that, your parents and your parents' parents had the amazing life and opportunities here in America. And, they might say, well, we worked hard, and these refugees, they're just going to take up our resources. And that's when you really try to bring out the facts and figures. You can say, like, actually, no, they're working really, really hard, perhaps harder than you. They're paying back X, Y, and Z dollars in taxes in these given years. So I think, again, it's a huge challenge, as President Obama said, to find that mutual understanding at whatever level you are, local, state, or federal, and even across the world. But we have to try, and we have to try to do that with a cool head and with some compassion, hopefully, and with a good mixed balance of stories, facts, and figures.
Thank you, Saba. Isra, according to you, how to build true inclusion?
I think, the key to being able to build true inclusion and mutual understanding is recognizing privilege first and foremost. And I think that is something that is so critical that we've seen play out. Like, we have as legitimate, serious issues of white supremacy, of colonialism taking place, like, in America, but also in other parts of the world. And that's where I think it's a lot of the systemic oppression, systemic racism starts, right? And it's right there. And I think you want to talk about mutual understanding, you want to talk about inclusion, you want to talk about diversity. We can't have those conversations about what that looks like and how we get there without recognizing and coming to terms with and being held accountable for our privilege and how we contribute to these systems that continue to win, right, in the country. And we've seen that play out, especially in the COVID pandemic. That's just one of the many ways in which you've seen it play out. So for me, it's really important that, we continue to recognize the privilege we carry, privilege, for example, that I carry as a fair-skinned white woman in particular. Like, yes, I have a different identity as being a Muslim, invisible Muslim, and that comes with Islamophobia and discrimination on that piece, but there's still so much, like, I am white passing, right, without the hijab. So it's really, really important to remember that individually we carry privilege, and just thinking about that, especially if we are people who are not a people of color, if we are people who are not the Black community, it's so important to recognize that. And that, I think, is where a lot of the missing education and accountability piece is in our country. and probably globally, it's that lack of confronting it, lack of acknowledging it, lack of, claiming it. We've seen with our movements, or the Black Lives Matter movements, it wasn't enough to just say, hey, I'm not racist. No, you have to be anti-racist, which means you're committing yourself to doing the work that it takes to be anti-racist. And that is not just by making a statement or by posting a post on social media or by sharing something. That is a true commitment every single day, where you're challenging your privilege and you're challenging your biases that play out in the most subtle of ways and that play out in front of you also. And the component of that is that bystander intervention piece, right? And one of the ways that you show up to communities of color and Black communities, and recognizing your privilege, and to vulnerable communities that you can't relate to, for example, because of your privilege, like migrants, like refugees, etc., is by showing up in those spaces where you hear someone saying a comment that is clearly racist or xenophobic, problematic, and you respond and you say, hey, that's not okay. Like, you stop it in its tracks there. You acknowledge that, okay, I don't understand this community, what it's going through. I maybe cannot relate, but I can understand one thing is that this is wrong, right? These are moral issues that, to me, don't really have you can have a different opinion. There's no different opinions, in my opinion. In my view, there's no differing opinions on these issues. You can't really try to justify any of this. You truly can't justify racism. You can't justify xenophobia. You can't justify any of it, other than the fact that it's coming from, right, deeply institutionalized white supremacy and racism in you, like, and from the communities that you see and from the things that you witness. And so for me, that's the first step. And to show up as a accomplice, which I like to use more than the word ally, but I know ally is more nuanced and more recognized universally. But what does that mean to show up as an ally? Like, once you recognize your privilege, once you get yourself educated, because it's on you to get educated, not on other communities to educate you, what does that look like? Making sure that you are constantly challenging, getting the information of why this is important, but then solidarity, right? And what does that mean? It means to amplify the voices of those who are directly impacted. It means to not take up space on the mic on every platform you can, like when it has nothing to do with you. It means passing the mic, right? And so it's so important. And you can think of so many examples, probably in your professional life or in your school setting, or even in the work that you do now, or even in events where you see that, who's speaking up for these communities? Are they people who are directly impacted themselves? If they are, that's amazing, right? But if they're not, that's a problem. And how do we make sure that we're even addressing those matters? So bystander intervention, amplifying the voices of people who are directly impacted on social media, in real life, in person, staying educated, constantly holding yourself accountable and checking yourself on these issues, because no one is perfect. We all make mistakes. And as we're growing in this way, and as we're on these battles where we want to be better people, better humans, better people who are understanding and educated on these issues and how we show up for vulnerable communities, we have to be able to claim our mistakes, own them, be accountable to them, and move on and grow from them, right? And not do them again. So I think that it's really, really important. But I think it starts on the individual level, and it goes from there. And I've seen that a lot of change has come actually from the one-on-one interactions that I've had with people. And so just recognizing that there's a lot of growth opportunities, a lot of potential to build proper inclusion and to build proper, mutual understanding. But there's also, you're going to come and confront people who don't want that. And no matter what you do, no matter how you present your facts or your picture or your story or however it may be, try to frame the issue for them, they're not going to hear you. And for those people, I tell people all the time, like, you try your best. And when you see that this person is just actively not hearing you, not listening, does not want to change, does not want to, be held accountable, then you sort of have to let that person be and just wish them the best and kind of like wish them healing, wish them education, wish them, this moment where they come to terms with it, but not focus on those things. And I think that if you focus on the broad majority of people who are open to hearing, who are hopefully open to learning, that's where you can start building those ties.
Acknowledging, as you said, acknowledging the limits, educating ourselves, definitely. But I will say that this takes time. This takes a lot of time. And on the other hand, we see that, enabling inclusion has to start from now. It's urgent. So, how to really, move forward from now and act? How to do so for you? What can we do? Yeah, what can we do now concretely? Because we need to educate, to talk. We need to talk about the situation. But while people are waiting to express their potential, to be recognized and truly included? What can we do?
I definitely think by just literally getting educated, starting today, right, on whatever that may be. If you feel like you don't know enough about an issue or about a community, get started today. The internet has vast resources, and you really can't make the excuse of not being able to find non-biased, like properly objective resources on these issues with a quick Google search. There are also advocates and influencers and people who are public figures who are recognized in these things, academics who've put in, life amount of work and labor to be able to educate the world on these things. And so really tune into those issues, but then start challenging yourself now. Like if there's an issue in the world today that you haven't spoken up about, that's truly an injustice and that's truly targeting migrant communities, it's on you to speak up about it. Right? Whether that's using your social media platform or whether that's you speaking up in your school setting or in your work situation, your work boundaries, finding ways to connect with those organizations that support those communities, right? Donating to them, volunteering your time and your energy to support these vulnerable communities is really important. So it's important to not just like talk the talk, but really walk the walk. And that means investing time and energy and your own resources into these fights and into these struggles and into these movements for liberation and for support of these, communities of color in these vulnerable communities. But I would say take action now, right? And it's very important that I note that it's so important to not just show up for your own community, right? Like me being a Syrian American, visibly Muslim woman, I was out there, of course, on the Muslim ban, fighting every single day here in our country for 4 years until it was repealed. But I was also out there supporting, standing solidarity with other movements, from Black Lives Matter to different things around undocumented people, all these different movements of inclusion and fighting for the rights of other people in our country, because we mutually understand, at least in the activist community, that when they come for one community, they come for all. And that there's nothing that separates us in terms of our freedom and our movement for freedom and our movement towards liberation. So it's so important to recognize that you shouldn't just focus on issues that maybe you in particular care about or that relate to you or impact you directly, but rather really challenge yourself on how to stand in solidarity with people. But that really means by taking action, asking directly impacted people how they want you to support them, how they want you to show up. Don't just assume because you probably don't know.
And I would love to ask also another question to Saba. I mean, we're talking about, maybe sometimes to people that are convinced, and we see that people that are, and too often people that are only convinced act and the other only observe. How can we leverage people's interests also, and not only their willingness to do good? And maybe can you share with us also some successes you've seen that bring you hope and that could also maybe talk to other people that are not concerned, but in fact they are.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. I think everything Isra said, I totally agree with. It's really up to us to take action. The only problem with that is that we happen to be people who are in tune to what's happening with the world. Many, people who with privilege, again, I love the fact that we need to first recognize our privilege. Many people aren't able to recognize their privilege. They do not understand what is the difference between being not racist and anti-racist. I can pull this book off my shelf right now, How to be an Anti-Racist. I mean, there is a difference. There is work going on there that many people are just oblivious to. So in my mind, that activation energy, that literally activation energy that's required to go from a state of oblivion to a state of being nuanced and understanding, having a critical eye, of taking action, of like supporting different communities, being part of these marches, being part of, advocacy for climate change, of Black Lives Matters, undocumented Americans, and, DREAM Act, and, all of this other stuff, the Muslim ban, etc. I mean, it really takes that. You need to have that activation energy. And I think the way to get there is by being able to, like, let's say, having one of us in a community of 100 people, for example, or 50 people, like in our own society, at our workplace, at, the markets, at, by what we wear, by what we see, by how we act. I think we can slowly influence others, and we can help them understand, like, hey, like even our own families, they don't understand the difference between anti-racism, racism, and not being racist, right? Like, and not standing up for others. So I think, slowly by teaching each other and by being able to, like, let's say somebody doesn't want to read a book on how to be an anti-racist, then maybe send them little snippets. Like, hey, this is what this means. Here's a TED Talk on this. Here's a little quick video, so like very small nuanced ways to help make these changes happen. But on a wide media is a huge resource that we need to kind of take upon us to get, like, big folks out there, actors, media artists, etc., come out on TV, on ads, etc., saying this is not right and this is what it means to be anti-racist. People are watching, TikTok, and Gen Z, come on, like, people are influenced by social media. So why don't we take the influencers, Rihanna, Jay-Z, whoever it is, come out there and say, hey, I'm here marching in BLM. And this is what it means for Black Lives Matter. Like, what does that mean? And I think, like, most people, it's just really hard for them to take action and to, like, get up and say, you know what, I'm being racist. Like, let me reflect. Most people don't do that, unfortunately. So I really think it's really up to our communities to help each other, and of course the media and political leaders to come out and visibly make those statements.
Thank you. And I would like to bounce back on one thing you said really shortly. It was about workplace. Influencers have a lot of levers, of course, to act, but companies too. And on the other hand, people, when they migrate, when they are migrants, they acquire so many qualifications that are not worth much. So how can we also show companies that there are, like, so many qualifications? And what's the role also of companies in the middle of that? Because sometimes, on the one hand, states are powerful but slow. People, on the other hand, can be alone and maybe also weak and some weak. They are not, of course. And you talk about communities, coalitions. Are companies those coalitions somehow?
Yeah, I really think that it's really important that, big corporations recognize the social responsibility that they have. And, research shows that once you invest in social responsibility and acts of social responsibility, and that's something that I'll give a huge shout out to One Young World for, is advocating about that and collecting companies that do that. I think, once they do realize, hey, there's benefits to participating in corporate social responsibility, then you realize that, hey, not only is there economic advantage to your own corporation by investing in social responsibility, you're doing good. You're doing good work around your community. If you are, imagine, like, Nike, you're coming out and, like, speaking up, in the movements and BLM, and, you're saying, hey, this matters. People will listen. Like, everybody wears Nike. Like, come on, So it's, I think it's really, really important that corporations also take a stance, also recognize their privilege, also recognize their status, and get out there and speak.
That's true. And if you allow me, I would like to share one example. With my company, we work with, for example, IKEA. Everybody knows IKEA. They recruit 2,500 people right now. We don't speak about that, but they have the willingness to act. And what do they say? First, they wanted just to do something good, and they realized that it was so good for their business that now they do way more. And they want to just, increase their objective, just because they also saw that it was not only about their willingness to do good and to, have an impact, but it was totally aligned with their business. It's a good example of that. And so many companies could do much more about that.
Yeah, totally agree.
I see that 2 minutes are remaining, so we'll have to sum up our little exchange. I would like to ask you one very concrete question. If I'm a citizen or a collaborator in a company, and I want to contribute in improving migrants' lives and enabling true inclusion, what can I do? You already talked about that, but if there were 2 things I could do from tomorrow, what would that be? Isra?
Well, I think I need a minute to think about this, but I think it's different if you're like a citizen versus a company. I think as a citizen, what you need to do is by getting educated on migrant journeys and surround yourself and really learn and listen and read journeys and stories of migrants who've been so gracious and generous to share, right, their resilience and what they've encountered. Recognizing that statistics are helpful, but that these statistics represent real people is really important. And the only difference between you and these real people they represent are circumstances and luck. Truly, any of us could have been in the shoes of refugees or in any of these migrants that we're referring to. Anybody could be. And so that's so important to recognize that just truly your privilege, your luck, and your circumstances is what differs you from other people. So that's the first thing is get educated and then connect to organizations and people who are doing work with these communities, who are directly connected to these directly impacted communities, and find ways for you to really engage, whether that's volunteering with them, whether that's attending one of their webinars or events that they're doing, whether it's donating to them. It's so important that we also use our purchase power and our collective financial and economic power to support these organizations, because they do carry on the majority of the labor. They do all the work. So it's really important that we invest in them. And as a company, I would say, first and foremost, have your policies be really inclusive of hiring people. Really hire people from these communities. Give them the income, give them a chance to be just like everybody else. I've seen many companies who say they're very inclusive and are very supportive, but then when it comes to potentially, sponsoring a migrant and figuring out how to make those things happen, it's almost like, no, we don't want to do that. We'd rather invest in people that we just easier to just hire through these processes. But for me, it's like, challenge yourselves, really commit to putting a number of this year. We want to hire X many people from migrant communities. What does that look like for us? How do we build a program where we're not only recruiting them, but we're also retaining them? Because that is really critical. If you want to see this, if you want to say someone your social impact, it's not just about talking about it. It's about really putting your financial power as a company behind it as well, and investing in those policies. Second of all, investing in policies that are better and more focused on becoming anti-racist and becoming some people in the culture in your workplace that is pro-immigrants, pro-migration, and against all the different types of xenophobia that we referred to today and the different types of discrimination. It's really important to build that culture internally. And so I want to just really emphasize that is something that you can truly do, is making sure your staff and employees have a space and have a culture that calls in supporting of these communities.
Thank you very much, Isra. Saba, 2 things the collaborators or the citizens that are listening to us could do from tomorrow.
Yeah, I think quickly, I know we're running out of time. Just, if you are somebody already kind of aware and in tune, make sure that your company is also. Make sure that your organization is lifting these values and changing their mission and vision to align with yours. Whatever you have to do to help change that, if you are not in a leadership position to be able to do that, find a way to do that. Make that change happen within your organization. And secondly, if you realize that, hey, I'm in tune, but my coworkers aren't, my community members aren't, get out there and try and work your magic and talk about these things and get them to be aware. So your colleagues, host these reading sessions, watching sessions, etc., where you talk about these values within your organization. I think that's really, really important. So if you are in tune, make those changes happen within your organization and within your teams. And if you're not in tune already, then just have an open mind, have this eye to see change and become in tune with that. It's really hard to try to give advice on that, but really I think overall it's people like us who can go in there and make those changes happen within our organizations.
Thank you very much, Saba. Thank you, Isra, too. Thank you for your contribution and for this very insightful exchange. And I'm really hopeful. I know that the road is long. We know that the road is long, but definitely after this exchange, we know also that solutions exist. There are many, difficult to choose them also by answering this question. But let's go and enter into action. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you all. I mean, I'm humbled by each of your work, as I've said with every session, but each one just stimulates so many new ideas and new thinkings. But what has really struck me, I mean, there's still no silver bullet when it comes to changing the negative perceptions. I mean, so much of this work relies on promoting our shared humanity. And I hope that we can achieve this change that we're looking for. But just to summarize some key points that really stuck out, we have to continue communicating the value that migrants bring to our communities and economies. We still do. We've clearly seen the economic contribution they can make, but as we've heard, the facts alone are not enough. So we need the humans behind the facts, and that will really help shift the dial. And we need to continue reminding everyone that people do not choose to become refugees. I mean, you know, Saba, your story always just brings me to tears nearly, because you're such an amazing success case too. You know, you have contributed so much to the US. I mean, there are other Sabas out there too. We need to amplify your voices and highlight your narratives and, you know, eliminate the harmful messaging. There's also an amazing documentary on Saba, which I highly recommend you all check out. But to those who are in the audience who are already, you know, fired up about this issue, it's important to challenge yourselves and stand in solidarity with others. You know, as Isra said, ask how people want you to show up and support them. You know, that showing up matters so much more than you might think. And there really is strength in numbers, and the media, as was mentioned, has a huge role to play in this. So there's so much work to be done, but knowing the work that each of you is doing, there is no shortage of hope here. That has been said, but there really isn't a shortage of hope. And so hopefully we can build the types of societies that we want to see in our lifetime. But thank you to each of you for your time, your precious, precious time.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Zafora.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Saf.